The air in the Seoul penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the unspoken threat of the Vipers Cartel. Seokjin Kang stood like a monolithic shadow, his deep purple-tailored suit and visible neck tattoos serving as a stark warning to any who dared approach. Known as the Untouchable, his cold composure shattered the moment his gaze landed on the center of the room. There, 8-year-old Nyla Park, her voluminous curls framing a face of striking beauty, reached toward the gold-plated peace offering sent by his rivals. To the hardened men in the room, the gift was a silent mystery, but to Nyla, it was screaming. Inheriting her late father's genius, Nyla's pattern sight allowed her to perceive a faint, rhythmic hum radiating from the box, a frequency of light and electronic patterns that others could not detect. Before Seokjin could lunge forward to pull her away, her small fingers unlatched the lid. A toxic, emerald glow spilled out, bathing her face in a supernatural light as the deadly light pulse device began its lethal countdown. The room descended into a state of panic, but Nyla remained eerily calm. While Seokjin reached out with an expression of pure alarm, Nyla stared into the swirling green mist with a sense of recognition rather than fear. To her, the device wasn't a weapon designed to incinerate everyone in the room. It was a complex digital puzzle her father had once taught her to solve as a game. As the high-pitched whine of the pulse bomb intensified, her hand hovered over the glowing mechanism, her mind already navigating the hidden encryption sequences that would decide the fate of the entire syndicate. The emerald light didn't just glow, it vibrated, a low-frequency hum that rattled the crystal flutes on the mahogany desk and set Seokjin's teeth on edge. The air in the penthouse office grew thick with the smell of ozone and ionized gas, a scent that usually preceded a lethal strike. Seokjin Kang, a man who had earned the name the Untouchable by remaining 10 steps ahead of every assassin in Asia, felt a cold, unfamiliar sweat prickle at his hairline. His security team, men trained to face bullets without blinking, had recoiled toward the edges of the room. Their tactical gear was useless against a pulse of light designed to liquefy the internal organs of everyone in the building. Nyla, get back. Seokjin's voice was a jagged rasp of desperation. He lunged forward, his tailored purple sleeve catching the light, but his boots skidded on the polished floor. He was a second too slow. His hand was inches away from the burgundy velvet of her dress when the device reached its critical phase. Nyla didn't move. She didn't scream. While the most dangerous men in Seoul were paralyzed by the looming specter of death, the 8-year-old girl stood perfectly still, her voluminous curls silhouetted against the toxic green glare. To her, the room hadn't descended into chaos, it had transformed into a beautiful, glowing map. Through her pattern sight, the swirling emerald mist wasn't a threat, it was a series of geometric pathways, a shifting lattice of data that mirrored the digital labyrinths her father used to build for her on his glowing tablets. She saw the heartbeat of the machine, the rhythmic pulse of the encryption key as it sought its final sequence. With a calmness that was more terrifying than the bomb itself, Nyla reached directly into the center of the box. Her small, delicate hand passed through the swirling green vapor. "It's just the infinite loop, Uncle Seokjin," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper beneath the high-pitched whine of the device. "Daddy said, always check the third gate." Her fingers danced against the internal core of the device with a rhythmic precision that was almost hypnotic. She wasn't cutting wires, she was tapping out a code, a physical override that bypassed the Viper's encryption through a backdoor only her father could have programmed. She slid her thumb across a concealed sensor, pressed firmly against a vibrating plate, and twisted. The high-pitched scream of the pulse device died instantly. The emerald light didn't fade. It imploded, sucked back into the golden box with a sharp, metallic snap that left the room in sudden, jarring darkness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the guards and the distant hum of the city below. Seokjin stood frozen, his hand still outstretched, his chest heaving. He stared at Nyla, who was calmly closing the lid of the box as if she were tidying up a toy chest. The lethal green glow had left a faint, shimmering residue on her skin, making her look like a creature of pure light. "It's fixed now," she said, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. Seokjin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ozone in the air. He looked at the box, then back at the small, biracial girl in the burgundy dress. The Vipers Cartel was known for many things: cruelty, precision, and an obsession with power, but they were never clumsy. They hadn't sent a bomb that could be so easily solved by anyone. This wasn't an assassination attempt, it was an activation. The device was a lure, a high-tech siren designed to find the one person in the world who could see through its patterns. The realization hit Seokjin with the force of a physical blow. The Vipers hadn't tried to kill the Untouchable boss. They had spent millions to confirm a legend that the daughter of the man who built their firewalls was still alive and in his care. As Nyla tugged at the cuff of his purple suit, seeking the comfort of his presence, Seokjin's predatory instincts took over. His posture shifted, his eyes scanning the windows for the glint of a sniper's lens. Nyla was no longer just a guest or the child of a fallen friend. She was a biological master key, the most valuable asset in the underworld, and every shadow and soul was now an enemy. The silence that followed the metallic click of the disarmed device lasted only as long as a heartbeat, a fragile vacuum before the world outside the penthouse exploded. The first high-caliber round didn't just break the floor-to-ceiling glass. It turned the reinforced pane into a million diamond-sharp shards that rained down like a lethal curtain. Seokjin didn't wait for the sound of the second shot. He moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a man who had spent a lifetime anticipating the moment the floor would fall away. "Stay down," he roared, though his hand was already moving. He didn't grab Nyla by the hand. He scooped her up, his powerful arm hooking under her knees and the other pinning her against his chest. The deep burgundy velvet of her dress vanished beneath the protective bulk of his purple-tailored suit. He felt her small, frantic heartbeat thumping against his ribs, but as he tucked her head under his chin, she didn't scream. She clutched the lapels of his jacket, her eyes wide and reflecting the chaotic strobe of red laser sights that began to dance across the dark mahogany walls. The Vipers weren't interested in a clean kill anymore. The gala had become a kill box. Seokjin pivoted as a second round thudded into the leather chair where Nyla had sat moments before. He felt the heat of the bullet's passage against his shoulder. With a practiced motion, he drew a blackened handgun from his waistband, the ink on his hand and wrist shifting as his muscles coiled. He didn't look for the sniper, he looked for the exit. His security team had already engaged, the rhythmic bark of suppressed weapons echoing through the corridor as the penthouse doors were kicked open by black-clad figures. "Vipers in the hall." "Tactical left," one of his men shouted before he was silenced by a burst of fire. Seokjin ignored the carnage, his focus narrowing until the only thing that existed was the child in his arms and the 6 meters of open floor between him and the private elevator. He sprinted, his heavy boots thudding against the marble. Another volley of gunfire erupted, chewing through the priceless art on the walls and sending plaster dust into the air like a thick, white fog. Nyla pulled back slightly from his chest, her curls dusted with white powder. She didn't look at the men falling or the blood blooming on the white carpets. She looked at the ceiling, her eyes starting with that same unsettling pattern sight she had used on the bomb. "Uncle Seokjin, the lights," she whispered urgently, her voice cutting through the roar of the gunfight. "The blue wires are pulsing. They're going to drop the elevator." Seokjin skidded to a halt just steps from the gold-trimmed lift. He trusted her without a second of hesitation. He spun on his heel, diving behind a heavy marble pillar just as the elevator cables snapped with a scream of tortured metal, the car plummeting 30 floors in a roar of sparks. The Vipers were moving in now, their tactical lights cutting through the dust. They moved with military precision, their silhouettes jagged and alien in the haze. Seokjin felt the vibration of their boots through the floor. He was pinned, his back to the cold stone. Nyla held tight against his heart. "Close your eyes, Nyla," Seokjin commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He leaned out from the pillar, his weapon barking twice. 2 Vipers dropped, their tactical lights spinning uselessly across the floor. He didn't wait to see them hit. He broke into a dead run toward the service stairs, a hail of gunfire chasing his heels. He felt a sharp, searing heat across his calf, a graze, but he didn't stumble. The weight of the girl was nothing compared to the weight of the debt he owed her father. As he kicked open the heavy steel door to the stairwell, a Viper emerged from the shadows, the barrel of a submachine gun leveled at Seokjin's chest. There was no time to aim, no time to react. Nyla's hand shot out from beneath Seokjin's arm. She didn't have a weapon, but she had a small, silver stylus she had snatched from the desk. With a precision that defied her age, she jammed it into the electronic lock of the door's mag swipe. The door didn't just close, it slammed with a hydraulic force that caught the assassin's weapon, snapping the barrel and pinning the man's arm in the frame. Seokjin didn't stop to marvel at her. He lunged down the concrete stairs, leaping over entire flights, the sound of the Viper's boots echoing above them. The Untouchable boss was no longer just a ghost in the shadows of Seoul. He was a shield, and as he descended into the darkness of the lower levels, he realized for the first time in his life that he wasn't just fighting for an empire. He was fighting for a miracle. The black armored SUV tore through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, its engine a low, guttural snarl that mirrored the fury in Seokjin's chest. Inside the darkened cabin, the only light came from the flickering neon of the city outside and the pale glow of a tablet Nyla held in her lap. Seokjin sat beside her, his breathing finally beginning to steady, though his hand remained white-knuckled on the grip of his weapon. The graze on his calf stung, but the adrenaline served as a cold anesthetic. He watched the girl from the corner of his eye. She wasn't trembling. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the tablet's blank screen as if she were reading a book only she could see. They reached the industrial district, a wasteland of rusted shipping containers and abandoned warehouses that served as the perfect graveyard for secrets. Seokjin navigated the vehicle into a nondescript freight elevator that descended deep into the bedrock. When the doors hissed open, they were met not with the grime of the underground, but with the sterile, blue-tinted brilliance of a high-tech black site. Rows of server racks hummed like a living hive, and walls of monitors displayed scrolling strings of encryption that would have made a seasoned government analyst weep. Seokjin grunted as he stepped out, his wounded legs stiffening. He led Nyla to the center of the lab, a sunken command hub surrounded by holographic interfaces. "This was your father's sanctuary," Seokjin said, his voice echoing in the vast, metallic space. "He built the firewalls for my entire empire here. He said it was the only place where the noise stopped." Nyla walked toward a massive glass console, her burgundy velvet dress swaying against her legs. She didn't look at the expensive hardware with awe, she looked at it with recognition. She reached out, her small fingers hovering just an inch above the glass. As she did, the monitors began to react. The scrolling data slowed, shifting from chaotic strings into orderly, shimmering geometric shapes. "How did you know the elevator cables were going to snap, Nyla?" Seokjin asked, leaning against a terminal as he began to unwrap a field bandage for his leg. "You didn't see the Vipers cutting them. You weren't even looking at the shaft." Nyla turned toward him, her voluminous curls catching the blue light of the servers. Her expression was solemn, possessing a weight that no 8-year-old should carry. "I don't just see the elevator, Uncle Seokjin," she whispered. "I see the breath of the building. Everything has a pulse. The lights, the wires, the air, it's all just patterns. Like the music Daddy used to play, but without the sound." She turned back to the console, and for the first time, Seokjin saw it. The air around her fingers seemed to distort, as if the very atoms of the lab were aligning to her will. "The world looks like code to me," she continued, her voice gaining a strange, rhythmic quality. When the Vipers sent that box, the patterns were jagged. They were red and angry, fighting the air around them. And the elevator. The blue pulses in the ceiling became thin and sharp right before they broke. I didn't have to see the cables. I saw the song change. Seokjin watched in stunned silence as Nyla placed her hand flat on the glass. The entire lab suddenly flared to life, a blinding gold light erupting from the core processors. The pattern sight wasn't just a way of seeing, it was a way of communicating. On the main screen, a complex 3D map of Seoul began to assemble itself, glowing with millions of interconnected lines. The Vipers are still looking for us, Nyla said, her eyes tracking a cluster of angry, flickering red dots near the penthouse. They're trying to find the master key. But they don't know that Daddy didn't hide it in a computer. She looked at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the monitor, then back at Seokjin. The Untouchable boss felt a wave of protective terror wash over him. He realized then that Nyla didn't just understand the code, she was the code. Her father hadn't just taught her games, he had encoded the ultimate failsafe into her very perception of reality. As the lab's cooling fans roared to life to keep up with the massive data surge, Seokjin realized their sanctuary was a clock. The Vipers hackers would eventually trace the massive energy spike Nyla was creating. He limped over to her, placing a hand on her small shoulder. The ink on his skin seemed to thrum in the presence of her power. Can you find a way to stop them, Nyla? Truly stop them. Nyla looked at the map, her gaze narrowing. The red dots of the Vipers began to turn into a shimmering white, forced into a new pattern by her sheer force of will. I can see their heartbeats now, Uncle Seokjin. All of them. They think they're hunting us, but they've already walked into the cage. The blue luminescence of the server racks cast long, jagged shadows across the lab, turning Seokjin's deep purple suit into a bruised, nearly black silhouette. He tightened the field bandage around his calf, the sharp sting of the wound a grounding contrast to the ethereal, shifting data Nyla was conjuring. The girl was still lost in the pattern sight, her small fingers weaving through holographic light as if she were playing a harp. But the air in the sanctuary had shifted. The steady, rhythmic hum of the servers was being punctured by a discordant frequency, a heavy, familiar footfall echoing down the freight elevator shaft. Minho, Seokjin's second-in-command and the man who had stood at his right hand through a decade of blood and neon, stepped into the light. He didn't come with the urgency of a soldier or the deference of a subordinate. He walked with the slow, heavy stride of a man who had already decided the price of his soul. In his hand, he held a tactical transmitter, its red light blinking in a mocking rhythm against the blue glow of the room. The Vipers are at the perimeter, Seokjin, Minho said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. He didn't look at his boss. His eyes were fixed on Nyla, reflecting the golden code dancing in her pupils. They don't want the territory. They don't even want your head anymore. They want the master key. And they're willing to buy it with enough wealth to rebuild Seoul from the ground up. Seokjin rose slowly, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. The tattoos on his neck seemed to darken as his pulse quickened. We had an agreement, Minho. Loyalty was the only currency that mattered in this house. Loyalty is a luxury for men who aren't looking at a literal god in a burgundy dress, Minho countered, finally meeting Seokjin's gaze. You're throwing away an empire for a ghost's child. Scott is dead, Seokjin. But the girl? She's a biological goldmine. I've already sent the coordinates. The Vipers' heavy hitters are 5 minutes out. Walk away, and you keep your life. Stay, and you die for a pattern you can't even see. Nyla's fingers froze midair. The holographic map of Seoul flickered, the steady white lines suddenly turning a violent, jagged crimson. She turned toward Minho, her voluminous curls shadowed by the darkening screens. Uncle Seokjin, she whispered, her voice trembling with a clarity that chilled the room. The patterns in his head, they're broken. They look like the Viper's box. Sharp. Cold. He's already sold the light. The betrayal was a physical weight in the room, heavier than the armored doors and the concrete walls. Seokjin didn't waste breath on an argument. He saw the shift in Minho's shoulder, the way his knuckles whitened on the transmitter. Minho was faster than most, but he wasn't the untouchable. The violence was sudden and absolute. As Minho reached for the sidearm at his waist, Seokjin lunged. He didn't lead with his weapon. He led with the sheer, crushing force of a man who had nothing left to lose but the girl behind him. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his purple-clad shoulder slamming into Minho's chest. They crashed into a server rack, sparks erupting as the delicate hardware shattered beneath their weight. Minho roared, swinging a heavy fist that caught Seokjin across the jaw, but the boss didn't flinch. He grabbed Minho's throat, his ink-covered fingers digging into the traitor's skin. For a moment, they were 2 shadows silhouetted against a backdrop of exploding data and screaming alarms. "You didn't just sell me," Seokjin growled into Minho's ear, the sound of his voice lost in the roar of the cooling fans. "You sold the only thing left that was pure." With a brutal, singular motion, Seokjin drew a concealed blade and ended the betrayal. Minho slumped against the server rack, the red light on his transmitter finally going dark as it slipped from his lifeless fingers. Seokjin stood over him for a second, his chest heaving, a smear of blood stark against the deep purple of his sleeve. He didn't feel the triumph of a victor. He felt the cold, hollow ache of a man whose world had just shrunk to the size of a single room. Nyla was standing by the console, her hands pressed to her chest. The lab was screaming now, red emergency lights rotating and washing the floor in the color of a fresh wound. "They're coming, Uncle Seokjin," she said, her eyes fixed on the elevator doors. "The patterns are everywhere now. They're coming from above and below." Seokjin wiped his blade on his trousers and turned to her, his expression hardening into a mask of lethal intent. He reached out, his bloody hand hesitating before he gently took her small one. "Then we give them exactly what they're looking for," he said, leading her toward the secondary escape hatch. "But they won't like the light when they find it." The secondary escape hatch led them into a cramped, reinforced sub-vault where the air smelled of stale electricity and old paper. The red rotating sirens from the lab above were muffled here, reduced to a rhythmic, low-frequency throb that Nyla could feel in the soles of her feet. Seokjin leaned against the steel door, his breathing heavy as he applied pressure to a fresh gash on his arm. The deep purple of his suit was now a map of his narrow escapes, stained with dust, gunpowder, and the blood of a man he had once called a brother. He looked at Nyla, expecting to see a child broken by the violence she had witnessed, but she was already drawn to a flickering console in the corner of the room. "It's here, Uncle Seokjin," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos they had just left behind. "The blue flicker I saw in the patterns earlier. It's a hidden heartbeat." She didn't wait for his permission. Her fingers, still shimmering with a faint gold residue from the lab's data surge, touched a seemingly blank metal panel. Under her pattern sight, the cold steel transformed. A hidden biometric scanner flared to life, recognizing a genetic signature it had been waiting years to detect. A small compartment hissed open, revealing a weathered, external hard drive encased in a protective lead shell. Nyla plugged the drive into a portable monitor. The screen didn't show a typical login. Instead, a series of complex, interlocking geometric rings appeared, the same games her father had taught her to play on Sunday mornings. With a few swift swipes, Nyla aligned the rings and the encryption shattered. The screen flickered, and then a face appeared. It was a man with Nyla's wide, expressive eyes and a weary but gentle smile. Scott Park looked directly into the camera, his image slightly grainy, but his presence undeniable. Behind him, a younger, less scarred Seokjin Kang was visible in the background, staring out a window with the same predatory intensity he possessed now. "Nyla, if you're seeing this, it means the patterns have finally brought you to the truth." Scott's voice was warm, a ghost of a lullaby that made Nyla's breath hitch. I knew the Vipers would come for my work eventually. I knew they would try to turn my digital shadows into a weapon. But I also knew they would never understand that my greatest achievement wasn't a code. It was you. Scott leaned closer to the lens, his expression turning solemn. People call Seokjin the Untouchable because they think he has no heart, no weakness. They see a monster in a purple suit. But I chose him because he's the only man I ever met who understands that some things are worth more than an empire. I didn't just work for him, Nyla. I entrusted him with my life so that he could be the wall between you and the world I created. Seokjin stood frozen, his hand dropping from his wounded arm as he watched his old friend speak from beyond the grave. The cold, lethal mask he wore for the world cracked, revealing a raw, aching grief. Seokjin isn't your captor, and he isn't just your boss, Scott continued, his voice echoing in the small vault. He is your guardian. I gave him the keys to the kingdom so that he would have the power to keep you invisible. He took the name Untouchable to ensure that no one, not the Vipers, not the government, would ever dare look closely enough to find you. You are the master key, Nyla, but he is the lock. The video ended with Scott blowing a kiss to the camera, his image dissolving into a final, complex string of gold code that Nyla immediately recognized as a GPS coordinate. The silence that followed was absolute. Nyla turned to Seokjin, her eyes wet with tears, but her gaze sharp with newfound understanding. She looked at the tattoos on his neck, recognizing for the first time that the ink wasn't just a sign of his power, it was a promise. He loved you, Seokjin said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He died to make sure the Vipers didn't get to that drive. I've spent 5 years trying to be the wall he wanted, but I didn't realize the Vipers were already inside the house. He reached out, his hand hesitating before he rested it on her shoulder. The connection felt different now. The weight of the debt had transformed into the weight of a father's legacy. Nyla took his hand, her small fingers curling around his scarred knuckles. The coordinates Daddy left, they aren't for a hiding place, Nyla said, her pattern sight flaring as she looked at the screen. They're for the Viper's central nervous system. He didn't want us to just hide, Uncle Seokjin. He left us the way to delete them. A heavy thud vibrated through the vault door. The Vipers had reached the sublevel. Seokjin straightened his jacket, his eyes igniting with a cold, focused fire. He wasn't just an untouchable boss anymore. He was a man with a directive from the only person he had ever truly trusted. Then let's finish the game your father started, Seokjin said, checking the magazine of his weapon. We're not running anymore. The black SUV burst from the warehouse like a shell from a chamber, its tires screaming as they bit into the rain-slicked asphalt of the industrial district. Behind the wheel, Seokjin Kang was a study in controlled violence, his eyes reflecting the jagged neon of the Seoul skyline. Beside him, Nyla sat with the tablet gripped in her small hands, her burgundy velvet dress a splash of warmth in the cold, blue light of the cabin. The sirens of the Vipers' pursuit vehicles were already wailing behind them, a discordant chorus of hunters closing in on the master key. Nyla, the grid, Seokjin growled, his voice vibrating with the hum of the engine as he swung the heavy vehicle around a sharp corner, sending a spray of gray water into the air. They're flanking us on the 3rd and 4th intersections. If we don't break the perimeter now, they'll pin us against the Han River. Nyla didn't look at the road. She didn't need to. Her eyes were glazed with the golden sheen of the pattern sight, her mind reaching out through the vehicle's uplink and into the city's sprawling digital nervous system. To her, Seoul wasn't a city of steel and glass. It was a rhythmic pulse of green and red signals, a symphony of data flowing through the underground fiber optics. She saw the Vipers' pursuit sedans as jagged, aggressive red blips, moving with a predatory synchronization. I have the veins, Uncle Seokjin, she whispered, her fingers dancing across the tablet with a speed that made the scrolling code blur. The light is starting to sing. A black sedan lunged from a side street, its windows darkening as a submachine gun emerged. Bullets sparked against the SUV's armored plating, a rhythmic percussion that Seokjin ignored as he pushed the pedal to the floor. The intersection at Mapo Bridge, Nyla. No. Through her sight, Nyla saw the traffic rhythm. She saw the countdown of the timers and the flow of the late-night commuters. With a decisive swipe, she shattered the local logic of the traffic controllers. The transition was absolute. As the SUV roared toward the Mapo intersection, the light turned a brilliant, welcoming green. But for the 3 Viper vehicles screaming in from the cross streets, the world turned red a second too late, or perhaps exactly when Nyla intended. She didn't just change the lights, she manipulated the timing of the automated bollards and the pedestrian signals. In the rearview mirror, Seokjin watched the carnage unfold with a cold, grim satisfaction. A heavy freight truck, its driver unaware of the digital war happening in his path, slammed into the lead Viper sedan, the impact folding the car like a piece of paper. The second car swerved to avoid the wreck, only for Nyla to trigger the emergency hydraulic barriers, sending the vehicle airborne before it crashed into a concrete pillar in a bloom of orange fire. 2 down, Nyla murmured, her eyes never leaving the golden threads of the city's code. But the commander, the pattern in the back is still steady. He's moving into the express lane. Seokjin glanced at the monitor. 1 blip remained, larger and faster than the others. That's the Viper Alpha. He's using a hardened frequency. Can you reach him? Nyla's gaze narrowed, the gold in her eyes deepening until it almost looked like fire. She leaned forward, her small frame tense. He's shielded, but the bridge has a voice. She dove deeper into the architecture of the Mapo Bridge, bypassing 3 layers of government encryption until she found the controls for the dynamic lane management. The Alpha vehicle was gaining ground, its engine roaring as it drew level with the SUV's rear bumper. Seokjin could see the driver's face through the rain, a mask of lethal intent. Close your eyes, Nyla. Seokjin shouted as he prepared for the ram. No, Nyla said, her voice possessed of a strange, echoing authority. Watch the light. She tapped the screen. All at once, the Mapo Bridge's high-intensity LED illumination flared to a blinding 10,000 lumen white. The sudden eruption of light transformed the rainy night into a bleached-out void. The Viper driver, blinded by the sudden surge and the reflection off the wet road, jerked the wheel. At the same moment, Nyla triggered the lane divider bollards directly beneath his tires. The Alpha vehicle didn't just crash, it disintegrated as it spun out of control, flipping over the bridge's railing and vanishing into the black, churning waters of the Han River below. Seokjin breathed out, the tension in his shoulders finally easing as they crossed the bridge and melted into the heavy traffic of the city's residential core. The neon lights of Seoul returned to their normal, steady glow, no longer weapons, but merely decorations on their escape. He reached out and gently took the tablet from Nyla's lap. Her eyes were back to their normal, expressive brown, though they were clouded with exhaustion. The song is quiet now, she said, leaning her head against the cool leather of the seat. Seokjin looked at her, then back at the road ahead. They were clear, but the war Scott had started was far from over. He reached over and tucked a loose curl behind her ear, his scarred hand surprisingly gentle. Sleep for a while, Nyla. We have a long way to go before dawn. The cold, sterile air of the Vipers' subterranean headquarters smelled of ozone and terminal hubris. Nyla sat in a high-backed interrogation chair, her burgundy velvet dress appearing like a drop of blood against the stark, white-tiled floor. Her hands weren't bound. The cartel leaders believed that steel locks were unnecessary for a child, especially one they viewed as a delicate vessel for the world's most powerful code. Standing across from her was the Viper commander, his neck tattoo a jagged dragon that seemed to writhe under the fluorescent lights. He didn't want to hurt her, not yet. He wanted her to look at an encrypted black terminal and breathe life into a dormant weapon. Your father was a genius, Nyla, but he was a fool to think a man like Seokjin Kang could protect you, the commander said, his voice echoing with a hollow, metallic edge. Open the gate for us and the world becomes a playground. Refuse, and we will find the code in your mind one shard at a time. Nyla didn't look at him. She looked at the terminal, but her pattern sight was already bleeding past the screen and into the very walls of the lair. To her, the room wasn't made of concrete and tile. It was a cage of intersecting blue lasers, humming power lines, and invisible data packets. She could see the rhythmic pulse of the ventilation system and the flickering heartbeat of the security cameras. The Vipers thought they had captured her, but they had actually brought a master key inside their own lock. The patterns are angry here, Nyla whispered, her eyes beginning to shimmer with that familiar, haunting gold. They don't want to be held. She reached out and touched the terminal. The commander stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with greed, expecting her to unlock the global backdoor. But Nyla wasn't looking for the Viper's prize. She dove deep into the building's internal security architecture, bypassing the primary firewalls with the ease of a child walking through a familiar door. She found the nerve center of the facility, the grid that controlled the exterior floodlights and the emergency sirens. Instead of unlocking the weapon, Nyla began to sing to the building's power core. She didn't trigger an alarm, she created a pulse. Outside, in the shadows of the rain-drenched industrial valley, Seokjin Kang stood beside the smoldering wreckage of a decoy vehicle. His purple suit was torn, and his eyes were dark with a cold, terrifying stillness. He was alone, his team scattered or dead, facing a fortress he couldn't breach through force alone. He gripped his weapon, his knuckles white, staring at the windowless concrete mass of the Viper's lair. Suddenly, the night sky was shattered. The massive, high-intensity security arrays on the roof of the fortress began to strobe in a rhythmic, jagged sequence. It wasn't a standard SOS. It was a pattern of light that mimicked the infinite loop, the very game Scott had taught them both. 3 long flashes, a stuttering blue pulse, and a final, blinding white flare. Seokjin's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a signal. She was alive, and she was talking to him through the enemy's own nerves. The patterns in the light weren't just a location. They were a countdown. Nyla was overloading the facility's magnetic locks, creating a 10-second window of vulnerability that only he was prepared to exploit. I see you, Nyla, Seokjin growled, checking his magazine one last time as he broke into a sprint toward the heavy blast doors. Inside the room, the terminal began to scream with static. The commander lunged forward, realizing too late that the girl wasn't hacking the weapon, she was inviting the monster inside. The lights in the room flickered and died, plunged into a darkness that smelled of impending retribution. In the shadows, Nyla's eyes remained gold, watching the red patterns of the Viper scramble in panic as the heavy hydraulic locks on the main entrance hissed and disengaged. The Untouchable was at the door, and Nyla had just turned off the lights. The sound of the hydraulic locks disengaging was the only invitation Seokjin Kang needed. As the heavy blast doors hissed open, he stepped into the void of the Viper HQ, a silent predator in a torn purple suit. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the panicked shouts of guards who had suddenly lost their technological eyes. In the interrogation room, Nyla remained a motionless statue of burgundy velvet, her fingers splayed across the terminal like a pianist mid-crescendo. To her, the darkness wasn't empty, it was a vibrant, thrumming landscape of invisible energy. She dove past the facility's internal servers, traveling along the high-voltage fiber lines that anchored the fortress to the sole power grid. She could feel the vast, sleeping giant of the city breathing through the wires, the subways, the streetlights, the millions of glowing screens that kept the world distracted. The Vipers were trying to reboot their local systems, their red digital patterns frantically clawing at the void she had created. But Nyla wasn't looking for a restart. She was looking for a total collapse. Uncle Seokjin, She whispered into the calms, her voice a haunting, rhythmic melody that seemed to bypass his ears and settle directly in his mind. The city is ready. Can you feel the heartbeat? Seokjin dropped to one knee behind a tactical crate as a Viper guard fired blindly into the dark. He didn't return fire immediately. He waited, his eyes adjusting to the pitch black, his ink-covered hands steady on his weapon. He could hear Nyla's concentration in the way the very walls seemed to groan with electrical tension. At the terminal, Nyla found the central substation's heartbeat. It was a massive, glowing gold pillar in her mind, the lifeblood of the metropolis. With a final, soul-deep shove of her will, she didn't just cut the power, she redirected the entire city's load back into the Vipers' primary servers. The digital Armageddon was silent but absolute. Across the skyline of Seoul, the neon advertisements, the streetlights, and the skyscraper beacons flickered once, twice, and then vanished. A crushing, unnatural darkness swallowed the city, turning the metropolis into a silent graveyard of steel. Inside the HQ, the surge didn't just kill the lights, it overloaded the Vipers' tactical visors, blinding them with white-hot feedback, and scrambled their encrypted communications into useless static. The Viper commander screamed as his monitors exploded in a shower of sparks, but Nyla just watched the gold patterns dance. Seokjin rose from the shadows as the emergency air filtration died, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence. This was the moment Scott had planned for, the moment the world went quiet so the truth could act. He moved through the pitch-black corridor with a familiarity that defied the darkness. He didn't need to see his enemies. Nyla was feeding the location of their frantic, racing heartbeats directly into his perception, small pulses of gold light in a world of black. The Vipers were no longer a disciplined army, they were terrified men stumbling in a cellar. Seokjin moved through them like a scythe, the muzzle flashes of his weapon the only lightning in the man-made storm. Every step he took brought him closer to the room where Nyla sat, the center of the blackout and the architect of their vengeance. As he kicked open the final door, he saw her through the haze, a small girl in a burgundy dress, bathed in the residual gold of the terminal's dying spark. She was the only thing in Seoul that still held the light. Seokjin didn't look at the carnage he'd left behind. He only looked at her, his scarred face softening in the gloom. "The game is over, Nyla," Seokjin said, his voice a low, gravelly anchor in the silence. "Let's go home." The dawn that broke over Seoul was not the neon-soaked haze of the night before, but a clean, cold silver that seemed to wash the city's sins away. In the wake of the digital Armageddon, the Vipers Cartel had not just been defeated, they had been systematically erased. Their bank accounts were hollowed, their encrypted files leaked to every global agency, and their high-tech fortress reduced to a silent, blackened tomb. The pattern site had worked with surgical precision, deleting a legacy of violence as easily as a corrupted file. Seokjin Kang stood on the balcony of a new sanctuary, a quiet villa perched high above the Han River, far from the blood-stained marble of the penthouse. He was no longer wearing the torn purple suit of a street-fighting boss. He wore a clean, dark overcoat that hid the fresh bandages on his chest and arm. He looked out at the city, his dark eyes reflecting the rising sun. For the first time in a decade, the Untouchable felt a strange, unsettling peace. Behind him, the soft rustle of velvet signaled Nyla's arrival. She moved with a new confidence, her voluminous curls no longer dusted with plaster, but catching the morning light. She had swapped her burgundy dress for a simple, warm sweater, though her gaze remained as piercing and gold-flecked as ever. She carried the weathered hard drive, her father's final message clutched against her chest. "The patterns are different here, Uncle Seokjin," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the morning air. "The city feels like it's waking up from a long, bad dream." Seokjin turned to her, his scarred face softening in a way that would have terrified his enemies. He knelt so that he was at her eye level, the tattoos on his neck visible as he lowered his guard completely. "It's not just the city, Nyla. The game your father started is finished. You've given us a blank screen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming document, a legal decree that had cost him more political capital and secret influence than any territory war. He held it out to her, his hand steady. It was the formalization of a bond that had been forged in the green glow of a pulse bomb and the darkness of a total blackout. Scott wanted me to be your wall, Seokjin said, his voice a low, gravelly vow. But I think the world needs to know you have a father's name to protect you. If you'll have it, you won't just be Nyla Park. You'll be a Kang. And no one in this world will ever touch you again. Nyla looked at the paper, then up at the man who had carried her through a hail of gunfire without flinching. She didn't need her pattern sight to see the truth in his heart. It was as clear as the light reflecting off the river. She stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. I'm already a Kang, Dad, she whispered. Seokjin closed his eyes, his powerful arms pulling her close. The man who had built an empire on isolation realized that his true strength had never come from his weapon or his ink, but from the child he had sworn to protect. The underworld of Seoul whispered for years about the fall of the Vipers and the sudden silence of the Untouchable. They said the tiger had finally grown old and retreated to the shadows. They were wrong. A new syndicate was rising, one built not on fear and blood, but on a fusion of tactical dominance and a digital genius that no one could comprehend. They weren't just a mafia boss and a gifted child anymore. Together, they were the architects of a new world, a father and a daughter who moved through the code and the shadows as a single, truly untouchable legacy. The city continued to pulse, its millions of lights flickering back to life, but beneath the surface, a new pattern was being written. And this time, it was a song of home.